Hi, Henry. We're just okay. We'll go ahead and start the meeting. And this is the City of San Diego Commission on Police Practices Ad Hoc Transition Committee Planning Meeting of Friday, August the 6th, 2021, which means I didn't get called for jury duty. And I'll do the roll call per our Zoom window. So I'm Doug Case, and I am the first vice chair of the commission and the chair of the committee. We have committee member Nancy Vaughn. We have Brandon Hilpert, who is the chair of the commission and an ex officio member of the committee. And we have Patrick Anderson, a member of the committee. And then we have Alina Conde, who is our executive assistant. We have Charmaine Mosley, who is the interim executive director. We have Chris Cameron, who is our outside counsel. We have Kate Yevendetti, who is our liaison with San Diegans for Justice. And we have Henry Foster, who is chief of staff for Council District 4. Did I forget anybody? Mm-hmm. Nope. Okay. And so was there any public comment submitted, Charmaine?
No public comment received.
Okay. And so we invited Chris to join us to talk about a couple of issues. We put her first on the agenda because, as we've discussed at previous meetings, we need to conserve our outside counsel funds, and so we can't afford to have her come to every meeting and stay for the whole meeting. And so we put her first on the agenda so we can have our discussion with her, and then she can be excused from the meeting. And so the first issue was there was a request for an opinion really dealing with the issue of what our options are as a commission after the 1-year POBAR period. And that 1-year period, which starts at the time that the department becomes aware of the alleged violation, although it can be told, means that after that period of time, there can't be any disciplinary action or adverse action that affects an officer. And so one of the questions that we had is, can we, as a commission, in doing our review, find a sustained finding after the 1-year period of time? If the 1-year period of time passes before we have completed our review, or for an independent investigation, what are our options, keeping in mind that we're not going to be able to begin investigations until we have an implementation ordinance passed. We have operating procedures that have been adopted and have gone through the meet and confer process, and we have investigators on board, and we have cases that we are required to investigate, especially the officer involved shootings and custody deaths that are already occurring. And so I guess with that introduction, I will turn it over to Kate. Well, and by the way, I think everybody noticed that her memo was attached with the minutes. And so if you go through the minutes, you can see that. And so I'll let her give the answer to the question, and then we can ask her questions. So, Chris.
So just one kind of clarification. The question that was posed to us was a little narrower. It was whether you could, after the 1-year period, place a finding in a personnel file. And so that's a little bit narrower issue. I think that, and as you know, I talked to some of Doug and Brandon about when we kind of briefly discussed this memo, there may be some other things that can occur. So the question wasn't, can we make a finding after the 1-year period? It's, can it go in a personnel file? And for a variety of reasons, primarily one of the cases that we reviewed, we think that that's going to be problematic, and we think that you can't, because it ends up sitting there like a ticking time bomb waiting for the next time that this police officer has some kind of adverse action. And then the argument becomes, was the basis. This investigation completed after 1 year time in my personnel file was relied on. And that was the cause of why I didn't get this promotion, or why I got demoted, or got worse work assignments, or whatever the case may be. And so that's the challenge with a personnel file matter. Now, the next question, and which we didn't go all the way into in our memo, was, so what can we do? And one of the things in particular was what kind of, in other words, can you make a finding? And then if you make a finding, would it be releasable then under, for example, SB 1421, which makes certain kinds of findings by police oversight agencies releasable, and an exception to the POBAR confidentiality rules under the PRA, the Public Records Act. And we think there may be something in there, but probably not right now, because the problem at this present time is that you don't have your appeal procedures in place for sustained findings. So without, I don't want to give a full answer and say for sure that you can make a finding as long as it doesn't go into the personnel file. But I think that that is worth looking into. And I think in all of this, the challenge is that all of these things are going to be very case or fact dependent. And so, these are the kinds of questions that you're going to have to sort of wrestle with and have analyzed as you're developing your standard operating procedures and so on, and you're implementing ordinances and implementing policies. So with that, I'll take questions. I see Patrick has his hand up.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. And that's, as I anyway expected, that entering anything into the personnel file beyond the 1 year, however the 1 year is defined, with that particular complaint would be impossible under current law. I think it was last year, there were 2 cases in state court that seemed to suggest, although this, I don't remember, pardon me, if that was explicitly in the decisions or if it was an interpretation of the decisions. But in these cases, there was at least some of the POA, the officer unions were arguing that any further action by an oversight committee after the 1 year was prohibited by POBAR. And action was it was basically universal. Any further investigation, any case discussion would be considered a disciplinary action on its own. Do you have any sympathy for that interpretation of those cases or of the law? So
I think that's where POAs are going to tend to always argue. I'm not surprised that that would be their position going in. And a lot of these things are in fact fact specific. So in the course of depositions, in the course of emails, this all ends up occurring in the venue of a litigated matter. And so there's discovery, and there's testimony that's given by higher ranking officials within the department. And I'm sure the kinds of questions would be asked would be things like, are you aware that your oversight body found that this officer had committed misconduct? Did that factor into your decision in taking whatever this action is? And so in a lot of ways, I think for protective reasons, in not wanting to lose these kinds of cases, police departments are very conservative about, they want to be conservative about what kinds of things happen after the 1 year POBAR deadline, because anything that happens after that is certainly going to be scrutinized in, a contested matter. So, and I think, in a lot of ways, there's things that just haven't been litigated, within the 4 corners, very specific questions. For example, SB 1421 would seem to say that any kind of investigative oversight body's investigation of a sustained finding is now a public record subject to public release. Wow. So if that's the case, if it's going to be out there and it's going to be public, the kind of questions of like, how do you unring that bell kind of thing sort of begin to happen. And it all becomes, what can they figure out was in supervisory personnel's mind?
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. I think my my takeaway from all of this, it's really helpful for you to have walked us through this. So again, thank you. My takeaway is, so my question is going to affect us on the CPP, because after the 1 year, even if CPP decides it's going to continue doing its own internal investigation, IA and PD's, so internal affairs and the police department's collaboration in that investigation, in other words, giving us the information we ask for, giving us access to the documents we ask for, is likely to stop.
Yep.
And that's going to limit severely what the CPP can do. Now, this is an area of intense concern, because as those of us who were on the CRB and now on the CPP know from way too many cases, if an investigating sergeant holds a case or tolls it, as they call it, for any reason, that doesn't stop the clock in a lot of cases. In some cases it will, if there's a DA investigation or a homicide investigation going on. But if the case gets held so that we get it at the last minute, coming right up to that 1 year deadline, then we don't have any options in that case. If state law and federal law are, or well, state law in this case is as you say it is. So in the voters ordinance, there is a section requiring IA to give us its investigation at a certain point. I think it's 60 days or something, it may be 30. And if they don't give it to us by that time, they have to justify why, and they have to give us updates every 15 days or whatever it is in the voters ordinance. And I believe there's even a clause about having to go to court. So if the CPP pushes back, then I believe a judge weighs in and I think can compel IA to hand everything over and complete its investigation unless there's a good reason. In my opinion, Chris's answer to our questions means that we as a commission need to get behind those clauses as they were drafted and make sure the city council keeps them in there, because that is really the most protection we've got. Timely completion of IA's investigations and almost immediate transferal of all information to the CPP. Does that make sense to others? Do you see how I got from point A to point B with this?
I do. I'm not sure I agree with those provisions, but I see how they would be helpful. My concern is a little bit different, and mine has to do with what the commission can do in this interim period or after the interim period, but is my real concern. And so if we have, let's take an officer involved shooting case that happens after the commission comes into existence, but say that by the time that the implementation ordinance is adopted, the investigation procedures have gone through a meeting, confirm we have an investigator on board, the 1 year is already up. What can we do with that case? We have an obligation to investigate it, but if we investigate it and find that it wasn't within policy, what can we do? And that leads me to believe that if our options are limited, we may want to go back and revisit what our current game plan is, because our current game plan is for those officer involved shootings and in custody deaths, we review them, but we don't vote on whether we agree or disagree because we wanted to wait until our own investigation. But if waiting until our own investigation means that we can't weigh in on whether or not the action was within policy or not, it may be beneficial to go ahead and make a agree or disagree with the IA investigation. Anyway, so that's just my initial thinking, because it would be difficult at best to do an investigation knowing you can't come up with an adverse finding, because if you do the investigation and you just don't have a finding at all, that's kind of telling. And so others who have thoughts or questions. Nancy's raising her hand manually.
I can't find it on the screen, how to raise it. Usually it's there, but I don't see it today. Sorry. I think it's even worse than the 1 year limit, because Patrick and I are working on a case right now that's very important with sustained findings, and they're sending out the findings letters. And we haven't, I mean, they know we're weighing in. They've been sitting on this case for 2 months, 3 months almost. They pulled it back when, Patrick, in May? And then.
Wait, you're telling me, I know we can't discuss this publicly, but you're telling me that findings letters are going out about that
Yes.
case?
Yes, and I'm
No.
just livid. I've just been
No.
beside myself. But
Okay, we need
what
to
that
talk about that
does-
offline.
One thing,
What that does is it shortens our time for 10 months, and they send them out after 10 months, or they're starting to do that. And that gives us even less time to actually make a difference on these things.
well,
And it's just scary to me.
let me just jump in. I know that Patrick had talked about a time limit for the police department to make available its records. Under the measure, there's no time frame. It just says the police department must make available its records relating to any matter under investigation, review, or evaluation by the commission, subject to the restrictions of applicable federal and state law. I do not see anything in there that requires that you wait, that the procedure that you all develop require that IA have completed its investigation before you can undertake your investigation. So
That's general.
that's I guess imposed restriction beyond what the measure seems to require. That that may be how the implementing ordinance is looking right now, but I do not see that is required.
So Chris,
Moreover,
just to jump in on that,
Yeah.
but that's only for officer involved shootings and in custody deaths. For everything else, we do a review of the internal affairs completed investigation. So that's where it's built in.
Sure. But I don't see that as being required in the measure.
And by the way, Diana is trying to join, and she's in the waiting room, and I've clicked admit, and it still says that she's trying to join, and she did that before.
Yeah.
And,
It's been a couple of times. I think it's not connecting or something, but she's joining.
okay. Anyway, it looks like she's trying to join. She tried to join before, and it's not letting her join, but we did admit her. Yeah, but as Patrick indicated, there's really two issues. One is the issue of the investigation. We can begin our investigation once we have the procedures in place immediately. But the other issue is, it's going to be a minority of cases that we actually investigate. It's going to be the officer involved shootings. It's going to be in custody deaths, and then it's going to be ones where that meet the criteria for a discretionary investigation that we've voted to do. But on the others where we continue to do a review,
Okay.
that then also becomes problematic. And part of the reason that the department is sending cases out for review before the 1 year is they have to go through their legal process. To all of their discipline has, all of their sustained findings have to be approved.
Yeah, and if you're going to evaluate, if you're going to review IA investigations, which I'm looking further down here in the measure, and I think is the part that Patrick was distinguishing,
Right.
they would have to have sent those findings on to, or they would have had to make their findings in order for you to review the completed investigation.
Well, they have to make their recommended findings. So the way the current system currently works is that
Sure.
in most cases they don't close the file until we've weighed in.
Right.
but-
I
but-
don't know that the measure requires that way of doing business remains. And so that's going to be
it
something
does
that
not.
you've got to figure out.
It does not, although we have recommended that it be written into the implementation ordinance. I noticed that the voters version of the ordinance does that, but that is
Okay.
an important point that we think ought to be written into either the ordinance itself or the standard operating procedures for review, which may be the more appropriate place to put that. But that is a good point, that we need to make sure that, and it is in our current interim standard operating procedures. And so hopefully that will continue when we get to the permanent operating procedures, which will be up to the new commission to adopt.
And that just, as it just loads more into that 1 year period that has to happen, which, I think you're right. You can get some advantages from having a system that works like that.
So,
And this is Henry, just to clarify, Chris, you're absolutely correct. It's more of a I guess, based on the new authorities of the new commission, maintaining that same practice is what we would call now an imposed, kind of a self-imposed item. And the way that we drafted the implementation ordinance was to maintain those authorities and give that to the commission to address in their SOPs to determine how they want to conduct business now that they have the new authorities and what that actual interaction looks like.
Right.
So we did take that into consideration and felt
And
it was
there's
better served in the SOP as they get into the actual interaction and how they will conduct their operations.
Right. Okay.
okay.
Yeah, that's fine. It's not inconsistent. It's just, it's just more than you would have to do. But if it's an important piece of what's going on today that merits keeping, then great.
Well, good. It looks like Diana was finally able to to get admitted. So any other questions for Chris on this issue before we move to the other issue?
I have a question, just to kind of clarify. Currently, because you have interim standard operating procedures, the commission is still doing reviews, but cannot do investigations of what's mandated. Is that right? So
That's
it's
correct.
not like all those are on hold. They're just under the old. I just want to clarify because some public people watch this later. So there was a comment about how things weren't being able to be done, but what's not being able to be done is the independent investigation because the ordinance isn't in place yet.
That's correct.
But
Yeah.
you're still doing it the old way, basically.
Yes, but what we had decided previously and put into the interim procedures is for officer-involved shootings and in custody deaths, we would review them, but we would not take a vote on whether or not we agreed it was within policy or not until we did our own investigation. And what I'm suggesting is we may want to, not today, but maybe at some point, revisit that if our options are going to be limited after the 1 year has passed.
Right. And I think it would be problematic if, you could review, but then not have your own findings and not have something done, and that will hopefully subsequently be made public. But the other thing that, just from what Chris was saying, and I guess we've always thought this, and that's why the time periods were put in the voters ordinance, is that, obviously POVAR gives the police department a reason to delay. And so I think it's important for the commission to consider what's in the voters ordinance as far as actually putting in timeframes, even though it's not in the ordinance. Because the more you talk about that, and if the public realizes that there's no set timeframes, and you could, what could happen is what happened to Clurb, that you have to basically not do anything on serious cases. I think that's something the commission needs to consider.
Okay, why don't we add that to our list of items for future transition committee meetings? so we don't lose that. I agree, it's an issue we need to look at. Okay, the other issue that we talked with Chris about, and she decided she didn't need to write a memo. But at a previous meeting, we talked about our situation of our declining number of members, and I believe we're down to 16. If I
Can I just, sorry to pause. This is for Alina. The issue that we were just talking about, I just checked, it's on page 32 of the voters ordinance. What Kate was just referencing and I was talking about earlier,
Thank you.
under the records and investigative materials section, page 32. Yeah. Sorry, Doug.
Oh, no problem. And I see that Charmaine says we have 18 commissioners. That's good. It's more than I thought. But as the commissioners know, we attempted to have a meeting this past week, a closed meeting, and we're unable to get a quorum because we only had 10 that attended. We discussed it at a previous meeting of changing our interim bylaws so that the quorum would be a majority of the seats that were filled, which would give us more flexibility. And Chris advised against that, but in our discussion with her, she indicated it was probably more political than legal, that there wasn't a legal reason why we couldn't. In a discussion that Brandon, Charmaine and I had with Henry Foster, we learned that there are other boards and commissions that have actually done that because their numbers are less, their numbers of filled seats are less than the numbers of allocated seats. And so maybe just have Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I got the, rather than write a big memo, I just wanted to clarify that the advice that I gave was sort of in an interesting environment where we had the city attorney's version of the implementation ordinance, which looked like it was really trying to kind of restrict the options of the commission by saying that essentially implying that you were going to lose the ability to rewrite your own bylaws after a certain date if they had adopted it. And so in that environment, it was a sort of a political suggestion that you may not want to sort of do things that would create more ire and more desire to sort of control what you do. So that was where it was. And I apologize, it wasn't meant to be sort of a, you can't under legal standards have that. I think you can look at your bylaws and be more flexible. So I agree with Henry.
Okay, and so I'm going
I
to.
would just say, let's make sure that whatever you come up with for your bylaws, I can't say that you can do anything you want to under the sun. But, I think you probably have more flexibility than I was suggesting that you utilize.
And I know that we've had discussions here, and we've had some informal discussions amongst commissioners. And so I think the best thing to do is to refer it to the Rules Committee, which looks at our bylaws, to look at that issue and make a recommendation to the full commission. And there may be some other options as well. But at least we know we have more options than we thought that we had. So let me go back to the agenda and see where we are. And so I think that that's all we needed you for, Chris.
That's what I was just about to say. I'll save you the rest of your money. All right,
Okay,
thanks, guys.
so let me pull up the agenda here. Does anybody need for me to share my screen, or because I can share it? If not, I can just go through the agenda. Nothing really new on the budgeting process. The staffing, I think, well, Charmaine, are you still here? Brandon, can you give us an update on the status of the administrative aid?
Yeah, we're getting close to finishing up that process. We're doing some kind of checks with the city and hopefully going to be putting out an offer in the next couple days. So that'll be good. We'll finally be getting our staff up to 3.
Okay, then the next item, well, I thought I corrected it on the agenda, but I didn't. It says the assistant executive director. We since learned that the proper term is the deputy executive director, who's going to be the person who will coordinate community engagement. We have been looking at the possibility of doing an executive search for that. And Charmaine has inquired with the appropriate departments whether we can use salary savings, since the position was budgeted to begin July 1st and won't begin until later, to pay for that search, which would be approximately $25,000 is what we understand. And well, the first answer we got was they would prefer that we use non-personnel expenditures, but the most recent email that I saw from Charmaine indicated that we could use salary changes, but it may require approval of the council to make that change, to allocate money from salary to use for an executive search. And so I guess that's still under research, but that was what the latest memo that Charmaine forwarded to me this morning indicated. Nothing new on the implementation ordinance and the status of the potential outside counsel to be hired by the city attorney's office to draft the ordinance. Unless Henry knows anything new, we've heard nothing new on what's happening with that.
I have no update.
Okay. And
So just a question on that. So we have no timeline about when the RFP is even going out?
As I said, I have no update.
and that's something that the city attorney's office is doing. And they haven't given us an update, and obviously haven't given D4 an update. Brandon, do you want to talk about the office space? I know we got a memo from Charmaine.
Yeah, so we're still kind of going through the process. I believe the landlord's they need to approve us as a sublease. We did get some bids to get, or I guess it's not really a bid, but we have a project to actually do all of our IT infrastructure set up to get our internet and all the security stuff so we can actually have our city connections. That went out, I think, earlier this week. So we're moving forward. I think the idea is sometime in September is our hopeful move-in date.
Okay.
And that's it.
Nothing on standing rules other than our current plan is to not make changes to standing rules. Will need to be readopted or modified once there's a new commission. And so, for example, for our streamlined case reports, we did that informally as a commission without going through the process of formally changing our standing rules. Anything new with community outreach?
The only new thing, sorry, my video's off for just a few moments, is that I am doing an event with Marisa and Andrea for the San Diego Bar Association and Earl B. Gillum Bar Association Monday night. Yes, Monday night. And I have the invite. I'll send it around to CPP members.
Okay, the next item is the legal counsel contract. Charmaine is working on the paperwork.
Can I ask Patrick a quick question?
Sure.
Patrick, is there a registration fee for this one?
It's free. You have to go through, I mean, I had to register for it too, and you have to go through, it's because it's a bar association thing, you have to go through this process of setting up an account and, paying for a ticket, but the price for the ticket is $0. So,
Okay. All right, thank you.
yeah.
But you have to pass the bar first, Nancy. Just kidding.
That's okay, I'll do that.
You have to go before a panel of your peers and no, I'm kidding.
Okay. Anyway, so since Charmaine isn't here, I'm not sure where we are in that, but we're trying to move as expeditiously as possible to get the RFP out for our legal counsel. And in the meantime, we're extending, well, and actually, I don't know the exact status of the contract with the current legal counsel. I know that they were extending it, but they also had to get some approvals for the, I think it was $1,900 we went over in the last fiscal year. And since Charmaine's not here, she can give us an update next week on the status of that.
You
And
can give a quick high level summary on that, Doug. So on that one, we're working with purchasing and contracting to get all that taken care of. We have to write a memo to explain why we went over budget, and then that's going to have to go to the city council for them to approve. So we can retroactively approve that I think it's like 1,910 and change. So there's that, and then the contract with our existing outside counsel. We worked with purchasing contracting. We have the statement of work pretty much set up, and I think they're just going through and trying to get the actual amendment to the contract to update the name from CRB to CPP, and then also to update the dollar amount of available money to spend of $25,000. So I know that's all going through the process. I know Charmaine also had a training on, I'm going to get named ARIA, maybe. It's the city's, I think, their purchasing or contracting tool. She was doing something with that. And there's a couple of hiccups from what I understand, but we're moving forward to try to get that done as quickly as we can.
okay. And then meetings with the PSNL members are, as I indicated last week, our meeting with council member Von Bilpert got cut short. And so we scheduled a follow-up meeting, which was planned for this past week. She had to change that. And so it's now scheduled for, I believe, Tuesday or Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday of next week. And so there's nothing new there. And so then we can move on to unfinished business. And that brings us to Patrick's proposal. And let me see if I can share my screen and show it. First of all, let me find it. Let me see if I have it in the Word format. Hold on a second here. There we are. Okay.
Doug, while you're doing that, would you like me to remind folks quickly of the discussion that led up to this?
Sure.
Okay, so this is a document that emerged from me looking at SDPD data at the substation or beat level, realizing that the data is, as it's currently released, it meets very minimum requirements in terms of filtering it or specifying it in particular ways. And so the amount of labor required to actually do this kind of data analysis goes far beyond what the CPP currently has, and I believe what it will have when fully implemented. The data is far too raw to be incredibly useful or to be particularly useful. So we were talking about the composition of the commission, and the idea coming from our community forums and a lot of community feedback. And I know District 4 in particular, the council member is very thankfully focused on ensuring better representation on the commission. In particular, representation from parts of San Diego that experience much greater rates of unwarranted or warrantless stops, searches, seizures, uses of force, etc. So in our discussions on this committee, we wanted to make sure that that representation was in fact on the commission, the new commission. The voters ordinance released by San Diegans for Justice stipulates that 10 seats of the 25-member commission be designated for the I believe the 4 police beats, and beats again are very small neighborhoods within police divisions. So we're not just talking about, for example, Southeast, we're talking about a much smaller neighborhood. And there was concern on the commission, and I agree with this now that we've talked through it more, that limiting the nomination and selection process to that degree really is going to make it difficult to fill seats. And especially when you get down to the beat level, we're talking about, again, small neighborhoods. And so to mandate, for example, 3 commission members from the neighborhood with the highest rate of policing, it starts to get very tricky immediately. It also, because terms are 2 years and members can serve for up to, is it 6 or 8 in the current draft? I believe is it 8? And in any case, whatever
Yes,
number it is,
it is 8.
if you're basing an 8-year term potentially on beat data from one particular year, or even from a 3-year period averaged out, you're very likely to, there's just not enough flexibility built into that because the data change. Some beats, will have higher rates of contact for a period, and then that will shift to other beats. And so what I did is draft some language that relies on data collection that's already built into the ordinance draft that requires the commission to collect and publicize some data, but mainly it requires the police department to share, as written, the ordinance draft, the voters ordinance draft, and I believe there's a version of this in the city attorney's draft as well, requires the police department to share data at a divisional and substation level. So going down to the beat level, which means that the commission would not have to do what I was trying to do with this mass packet of raw data. So relying on that, so this sort of revises the idea. The idea is that every time there's a vacancy on the commission, and after we make sure that all 9 city council districts are represented, both of the youth seats are filled by youth, and then there are, I believe, 2 or 3 seats in the draft ordinance that are tied to the low and middle income census tract map. So after we make sure all of those are filled, every time there's a vacancy, the CPP should just look at the sort of top 10 beats in terms of contact rates. And the priority would be to go down that list first to fill that vacancy. And if all 10 beats are already represented on the commission, then this clause is no longer in effect. It no longer applies to the filling of that particular commissioner vacancy. So that builds in flexibility, both for as the, how the data changes over time, but it also, rather than mandating 10 seats to 4 different beats, it requires the commission every time there's a vacancy to go back to that list. So that's the idea. And I hope that this builds in enough flexibility, both for the data to change and for seats to actually get filled. I'll remind folks that at the end of this section in the voters ordinance, there is a section that says for any of these requirements, if after making a good faith effort, the commission is not able to meet this requirement, it has to justify that to the city council, but it can set the requirement aside just to fill the seat. Okay, so I'll stop there.
And if I recall correctly, that there was, and it may be in a different section of the city attorney's ordinance, but it seemed to imply that commissioners represented either a city council district or one of the geographical things, and so it didn't really allow for what I'd refer to as double dipping. And
I think the voters ordinance has that too. It says that, I forget exactly how it frames this, but I believe it does say that, for example, I might satisfy District 4 and this particular beat level analysis.
I'm not sure the city attorney's draft had that flexibility. So I think that's
No, I
important.
mean the voters. Yeah,
Right.
I agree. Yeah.
And that was part of our concern. So, and when we come up with our recommendation, we probably don't want to specify the section number because it won't necessarily reflect what because the city attorney's office is going to be the one that's going to prepare the next draft of the ordinance. So maybe just have section blank so that it corresponds with whatever section they have. But with that in mind, with regard to what Patrick has come up with, are there any
just if I can clarify, and this is just from my experience at the city, typically I have not seen a situation where individuals can represent, I'm going to say, multiple seats or multiple classes. Typically, if there's one seat, let's say if someone is appointed and serves in the 9 council district appointees, that same person cannot then be considered for another seat. You typically have to pick which one that you are there to represent. And there's no,
and that's what we're saying we don't want. What we want is to have we want to make sure that all 9 council districts are represented. But we don't want with the police beat seats that they represent that beat. We want to make sure that in the whole, so they're not
correct,
necessarily there. They're not there.
And what I'm clarifying is that I can't even tell you if I went through all of the different advisory boards and commissions to where you will see that language, but it is a standard that a person can only serve one designation in one seat. So there is no duplication crossover where someone's cross-filling, and I'm going to say you're essentially potentially losing representation, if I can say that.
Well, but so this isn't the same thing as having a seat per beat. It's closer to how in another section of the ordinance, there's a requirement that various diversities be represented. So for example, by racial identity, gender identity, sexuality, and so on, disability and ability. There's a general expectation in this section that that diverse representation be on the commission, but that doesn't mean that. That requirement can be satisfied by the board as a whole, including the seats that are designated by city council district. The spirit of this is that it be similar to that kind of requirement.
Well, and I agree with Patrick, and it may be different than what other boards and commissions in the city have done, but I think in order for our needs, we think it's important to have somebody from each council district, and those may be designated seats. We haven't really talked about that, so that you're representing that district. But the idea is we want to have diversity, and part of that diversity is we want to make sure that we have 10 members who are from over policed areas, for lack of the better word, but not have seats for I represent this particular beat, but just making sure that we have that diversity reflected in the full. And I guess a question that we haven't really answered in that is, would the youth seats be included in that? And so if we're trying to make sure we have all 10 of the top 10 beats reflected on the commission, if we had a youth seat and they came from beat 415, let's say that's highest speed, would that be included in the requirement?
No, again, when you are classifying, no matter how we do this, if you are classifying a seat, then a person can only fill that classification. So you will not have a use, if we have a requirement for a U seat, that same U seat will not serve as the beat designation.
Okay,
It's-
but
it
what
would
we're
be a
saying is we
different-
don't want the seats designated for the beats. We say we
Bro,
want,
I'm just saying, regardless, no matter what your designations are, a person cannot, once they go in as one designation, regardless of what the designation is, once they accept that, once they are selected and they are sitting as a member under said designation, that's all they can serve. When you get into the diversity, race, gender, that's a general comment that was previously in the charter that basically spells out, like we do with anything else at the city, is that you want the board to, you want to do your best to have the body reflect the diversity of the overall citywide community. So that's independent of.
and I guess we're saying that we think that the police beat ought to be treated in a similar type of diversity. So that, a person who is, you want to have a diversity of gender, but a person doesn't represent a male seat or a female seat, but you want to make sure that the overall board meets that diversity. And so we're saying that we think that a diversity characteristic should be being a member of the 10 seats. And so even though it may not be a practice with other boards and commissions to do it that way, but we think that's important for this commission. Otherwise, it's going to.
I think you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. Let's move forward. I don't want to belabor it. We can talk offline.
Okay. Other comments regarding?
I have I guess a couple questions, and I may be wrong, but I think where the confusion is coming in this discussion is the fact that you have a numbered designation. And so I think that it might be looked at as, okay, there's these 10 seats and each of these seats has to represent a specific beat. And I think that's what Henry is saying. You can't have that and have the person who represents D4 also represent beat number 1, 2, 3, or whatever it is. And so maybe that needs to be clarified a little bit, that the idea of the over policed areas diversity or designation flows over all of the seats. But my question is, because this is just my ignorance, when you say that somebody quote unquote represents a particular beat, does that mean they have to live in that particular area? And what I'm hearing is that that's kind of a small designated area. And how small is that? Are we talking about 10 blocks, 10 miles? What are we?
Yeah, so that's where I was struggling writing this, because I put in living, but I knew someone would raise this question, and I figured it would. I should have known it would be you. The way that this sometimes gets stipulated in various policies for public organizations is to say living, working, or enrolled with children enrolled in a school or something like that. In some way, living a significant part of one's life in that beat. Another way to approach this, well, there's not another good way to approach this, and that's because the police divisions don't map exactly onto city council districts, but they come close to mapping onto city council districts. And so if you jump up to the police division level, you're basically just replicating the city council district level. And so that doesn't work. So then when you scale down to the beat level, it makes more sense from a data perspective, because not every part of a district is going to experience the same rate of contact with police. It's really at the neighborhood level that you see it. Encanto would be an example of a neighborhood. So in Southeast, you'll have lots of little beats because the concentration of people living in that area is much higher than, for example, in La Jolla, where the concentration of people is just not as high. And so the beats are much larger in that part of the city. So it becomes complicated. I mean, on one hand, we've been talking about this now for 8 or 9 months, and we've been wanting to the community and this committee and the commission have been, and city council has been wanting to find a way to make sure that those parts of the city that experience these things have a voice on this commission and are prioritized in terms of recruitment and so on. And this is the best we've been able to come up with because it's where we've got data, it's where we've got geographical borders. So if you can see what I'm talking about. If you look at the map Brandon just put on the screen, in some parts of the city, the beats are quite small. So like Encanto is 433 in Southeast. North Park, if you look, is quite large. Linda Vista is quite large. But then you've got Swan Canyon, Fairmount Village, Emerald Hills, Southcrest, Shelltown, etc.
So another question I have for you, Patrick, is you're limiting it to warrantless searches instead of other characteristics like number of complaints, use of force complaints and so forth. And as time goes by, the warrantless searches may not be the best criteria, especially if the protect ordinance gets passed. There would be a sharp reduction in the number of warrantless searches.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't want that built into the into the ordinance. And so
this is the other thing I knew people would have questions about, and I did assume this would be Doug, so I called it. This is a hard one. I mean, as you know, for 8 months, we've been trying to figure out how to use a combination of data sets. So stop searches data, use of force data, RIPA data, alongside complaint data filed through the CPP and through PD. The problem with relying on complaint data is that it's easily manipulable. So if La Jollans got really jealous and they wanted more representation on this commission, then the strategy would be, let's just file a ton of complaints, you know, and then in next year's data dump, we're going to be the district with the highest number of complaints. That's a problem. So, yeah, so I agree that warrantless stops is not the final resting place of what this should be, but it's where we're starting.
So it looks like we have a couple of issues we need to kind of wade through. Not today. One is the issue that we're talking about of whether or not they ought to be designated seats and how we approach that if they're not designated seats. And then the other is whether the criteria that we're trying to include in the represent, what we're trying to get here is the quote over policing, and that's the best word I can come up with. I know it's not a precise word, but are there other
Henry and Nancy both indicated a desire to speak.
Okay, so I don't see them on my screen, so I'm going to go ahead and let me call Nancy first, and I'll get Henry.
That's good. My question is for Henry. Henry, if we have designated seats like you're talking about, such an inflexible structure, if somebody can't be found from a particular police beat, what would you have the commission do? Go without?
No, we would have to, the way it's written now, you would have to find someone to serve and fill that seat. We would have to look at doing some type of a clause to allow a provision or some relief. But I think what, you know, just going back to the draft ordinance and just listening to this conversation, we totally understand or understood the I want to say the desire and the desired impact. When we looked at this and what our concern was in listening to how business is conducted in regards to the commission, we were looking at how can we provide some stability. And we felt that with the moving parts and pieces of this type of data-driven methodology, that you would find yourself, as you said, Patrick, 1 year, this, as you go year to year, you have changes to changes. And what impact does that have to those seats who someone was ranked number 1, now they've fallen down to number 22. Also, just as you talked about complaints and going to complaint-based, depending on whatever is happening within a different community and how policing is deployed, they can still also, when you talk about certain types of stops or certain type of activities, based on how they go in, deploy, and saturate certain areas. So that can change throughout the citywide based on how they deploy. So you can almost end up where you can have in one beat, a really focus for a 6-month period of time, and then move on where you have another area that's as odd as it may look at times, where you see this swing of patterns and data to where now you're sitting there and you have individuals that are on the commission who no longer meet the criteria in which they were selected, which typically would mean they should now be stepping down as that has moved. So
That
it's
doesn't
those
make
types
it
of things.
stable.
Correct. And so that's why we tried to make it as stable as we could for things that weren't per se heavily data driven, that had a lot of variables and were not as static as we could get them, just based on what we hear on what it takes to actually ramp up, be able to go in and conduct oneself and serve as a commission to be effective and
Yes,
and be there.
thank you for that. And I agree with the struggle, because we've been trying to figure out how to do this too. I want to be really clear that this notion that we wanted more robust representation from communities that are experiencing the most issues with policing and over policing, that idea didn't come from this committee or the commission. It came from the community roundtables. It was one of the top, 5 recommendations from those community roundtables. And so I think we all, what I'm learning, Henry, from your comments is that I need to go back to the drawing board a little bit and figure out a way to bring, we've got to bring the data into it somehow, because it's the only thing that paints a picture of what the community was asking for. But what you're suggesting is that tying it to a given seat as what defines the appointment of that seat, that's going to lead to all sorts of issues. So Doug, let me take this back and think through it. Maybe Henry, we could talk at some point.
Okay, and that's fine. And the other thing, and just for context as to what our office's concern has been, and what the council member has been very vocal on day one, and what our fight has been with CRB in appointments, is as we look at, you say who's impacted, but that's where we try to dive into folks' experiences, and why you hear us talk about and really try to drive home what, someone's background, what's acceptable, what's not. And that's really where our struggle and fight has been. Not necessarily do you live in that area, but what is your life experience and your experience, to where if someone has had a run-in or had a record or had X, Y, and Z, where typically they would just be thrown out and saying, you know what, you can't sit here. That's really where we were trying to focus and say, hey, we need to have folks who have been part of the system, in the system, understand relationships and how things are done. As you're on one side of the equation, which is the public side and the impacted side, versus the police side. So that's
Yeah.
how we looked at, just to add context, where we were going was, hey, we need to make sure folks, just because you have a record, because you did X, Y, and Z, and it kind of give you a scenario. It's like dealing with homelessness and not talking to homeless
Yeah,
people
exactly.
who've experienced homeless, right?
Yeah,
You cannot make a decision. And so
That's
where
that's a
we were-
really important
that's where
point
we
to,
were
yeah.
guiding from, not necessarily because of all the nuances of the beats and how things can shift based on decisions that are made operationally within the department. And so that's why we went, decided to roll out what we rolled out. And I think we still need to have more conversations on, when we say folks that have been impacted, meaning records, things like that. I think there needs to be more of a robust conversation there, because I think you will see a very significant fight when it comes to appoint people that have that. And I think that's something that we need to continue to look, at least we will.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, that's something that we agree with you on 100%. And the voters version of the ordinance actually was very explicit about that, about certain things not being disqualifiers. We need to make sure that happens. And then you also raise an interesting point of, I think what we're looking for is the life experiences and the people that have had the experiences with the police. And simply because somebody lives in a police beat that has the highest statistic doesn't mean that person individually has had those types of experiences. So anyway, we'll let Patrick go back to the drawing board, but I think this has been a really healthy discussion to kind of get the issues out on the table. It's now 1:10, and we usually try to keep our meetings to an hour. And so my suggestion is that we hold the discussion of where different parts of the investigation process should be, i.e. the document that I sent out to everybody last night to next week's meeting, because that obviously will be a robust discussion.
Sorry, Doug, I deposed you. I preempted your document with my little email.
Oh, okay. So anyway, so is there any objection to starting next? Well, maybe actually keeping the same agenda. We can go back to see if Patrick has had a chance to reflect further on his.
Give me a couple weeks. Why don't we do yours next week? I'd like to talk to Henry more about this. I'd like to talk to Kate, and I'd also like to go back to some other folks in the community and have them chime in on this question of data and beat versus the question of lived experience in the system, and so on.
Me too.
Okay, and so I think it's a good idea. There's a lot of things we need to kind of. I think we all have the same goal. We were just trying to figure out what's the best way of getting there from from a structural point of view. And so I think it's a really good idea, Patrick. So I won't put the unfinished business on the agenda for next week. I'll put it on the agenda for the following week, and then we can put as the first item of new business the map of the investigative related elements. And then Elena, if you can put in the list of future agenda topics the one that we mentioned previously, so we don't lose that. Then I see your thumbs up. And anything else that people want to go over today? Okay, great. Well, and I've said it before, but I want to say it again. It really is helpful to have Henry here, because we need to make sure that what we come up with, we understand what District 4 is thinking, and so that we can try to resolve any differences or questions through this meeting, rather than in public hearings and so forth. So,
hey, just really quick, Alina, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. In regards to an update with the outside counsel, I was accurate in saying that I don't have an update on where the city attorney is on the process in their discussions. But I do want folks to know that we are doing our internal workings, Chloe, myself, We're listening to all sides of this conversation, and we are working on our potential updates and so forth. So we're kind of working as we are waiting. And so when someone does come on board, as we move forward, that we will be able to kind of work lock and step. So I don't want folks thinking that it's just sitting
Yeah.
there doing this.
I just like to comment, Henry, I'm glad to hear that, because I mean, at this point, I think as far as I'm concerned, and probably the community, that's yet another delay in holding up getting the ordinance going. And so we'd really like to get that RFP out, and we'd like to get a community input in all of that. So if you can keep us updated, I'm sure the city attorney's office isn't going to keep us updated on where they are with the RFP. So if D4 could, we'd appreciate that.
Okay, and then any other comments? If not, same time next week. We're slowly, wading through these issues, but they're all important issues. And the light is at the end of the tunnel. We may not be able to see it yet, but the end of the tunnel is there. And so everybody have a great week, and we'll see you next time, same time, same place. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.